Welcome to Ask Psych Sessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. If you have a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. That's bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. All one word, all lowercase. And here's our next question.
Thanks for joining us today. I am with Dr. Karen Stamm, who is the director of the Center for Workforce Studies, which is part of the Education Directorate at the American Psychological Association. So thanks for joining in to chat with us today. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me today.
You are welcome. I'm very excited to dig in a bit, but before we do that, do you think you could tell me and our listeners what even is the Center for Workforce Studies and what's your role there?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. The APA Center for Workforce Studies is basically a research unit at the American Psychological Association where we conduct research on the psychology workforce and education pipeline. We do a lot of work at looking at demographic characteristics, salaries, work settings, geographic locations, and any other characteristics that have to do with both the work of the discipline and the profession of psychology. We produce a number of reports, fact sheets. If you're an APA member, if you might have seen our data points, which are basically a one-page fact sheet style short report that we publish in every issue. We've had a lot of great successes at producing some data tools, and they're all available on our website, apa.org/workforce. So I'd highly encourage you, if you're unfamiliar with our work, or even if you are already know about the APA Center for Workforce Studies, please check it out. There's a whole lot of great information. We put all of our presentations too as we go to conferences. It's a great resource if you're trying to prepare the discipline of psychology for the future.
Great. That sounds like it'll be relevant and helpful both for our professors and probably also to pass along some of this information to the people that we're teaching. I got in touch today because you just put out a big new report, a new workforce report that I saw some highlights about with, shifts in what people with PhDs are doing and things like that. Would you be willing to chat for a few minutes about what you think some of the highlights were of that new workforce report?
Yes, absolutely. So this is a report that focuses on a specific segment of the psychology workforce. In general, our charge is to look at the entire discipline, but in certain contexts, we do need to look at a smaller segment. And this one focuses on the academic psychology workforce. We've used, and this one's a little bit different because we use data that we did not collect ourselves. They came from the survey of doctorate recipients from the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, which is located at the National Science Foundation. One of the benefits about many of these statistical agencies is they put forth public, or in this case, a little bit more detailed restricted access data that we get to use for free as researchers. And we were able to look at this survey and isolate psychology research doctorate holders who are employed in faculty jobs and look at some of their characteristics. Their numbers, their demographic characteristics, what positions do they hold, what types of institutions are they hired at, and where are they working, who's holding leadership positions, all of those kinds of characteristics. In terms of some of the numbers, there's about 29,000 psychology research doctorates who are faculty. And this is we estimate, it depends on how you break it down, about 15 to 20% of the entire psychology workforce. I should note too here that this does not include PsyD holders. This particular survey explicitly excludes those individuals. However, we suspect it's probably a fairly small number of PsyD holders who are employed in academia. Much like what I'm sure many of you are seeing at your own institutions, the number of faculty are increasing. However, the proportion of tenured or tenure track positions is decreasing. This is not unique to psychology. This is happening in a lot of other fields. And that's, I think, an important trend that we need to keep in mind. We've also found that about 16% of those faculty work in leadership positions, and that's one thing that we're paying attention to across the psychology workforce. We're beginning to see that some of the skills that are used in psychology jobs, leadership tends to rank pretty high as one of those skills. So that's kind of an interesting finding. We also see increasing representation of women as well as racial and ethnic minorities. For women, this is a trend that's been going on for a long time. We do see some differences as you look at the proportion of women at different ranks, especially a smaller proportion as you go into higher faculty ranks. The same characteristics tend to happen with racial and ethnic minorities. So I will say, especially with racial and ethnic minorities, we're seeing some slow shifts towards greater ethnic and racial minority status at different faculty ranks. So that is an encouraging finding, but it is a slow finding, and I think that's important to keep in mind. One other key finding, we are also looking at the number of faculty who are teaching in areas outside of psychology. And regardless of how we look at this, we're pretty consistently finding about a third of psychology research doctors are teaching in other fields, about 2/3 in psychology, 1/3 in other fields. We've looked at a slightly different data source that found basically the same thing. And we think that's an interesting finding because it's pointing to some of the interdisciplinary or the hub science nature of psychology, that there are certain areas of psychology that connect very well to other fields. And we see that reflected in this report as well as some of our other research.
So if I can just follow up on that last one for a second, do we have a sense about where that is? So my instinct is people are in business schools, maybe studying sort of organizational questions. Where else are neuroscience programs? Do you have a sense of where those 1/3 of doctoral holders are if they're not in a traditional psych department?
Yes. So actually, it's mainly education programs, and we think this is largely due to the presence of counseling psychology programs very often being located in schools or programs or departments of education rather than schools, departments of psychology. But it's also other social sciences, as you mentioned, neuroscience, business, computer science, and statistics. Those are some of the other common areas as well. So it's not necessarily isolated to one other field. It's a lot of different areas.
Okay, so don't tell my colleagues that I share a hallway with that I forgot that obvious answer, right? I share with the Department of Education and Professional Psychology. It should have come to mind more quickly. Low, I should have had the availability heuristic bias there. Well, great. Well, thinking about that, maybe we could shift gears a little bit if you're up for talking more broadly. I think a lot of our listeners work at more undergraduate-focused institutions, so we don't have a doctoral program, for example, in my department. Does your position involve ever sort of thinking about how psychology, I love that phrase, like we're a hub science, we connect, we're leaders. Do you have some data about how this also happens at the bachelor's level?
A little bit, yeah. We've had some successes at branching out into the other levels. We still focus very much at the doctoral degree level as defining that. That's our definition of psychologist. However, we're in a lot of situations, it's just as easy for us to go backwards to master's and bachelor's levels. If you give me a second, I will pull up one of our more recent data points. We did an analysis that looked at the types of skills that are used in jobs. We looked at jobs that require either a graduate degree or more extensive preparation, and ones that require bachelor's degrees or maybe a little bit less extensive preparation. And interestingly enough, the skills that are important to these jobs were very similar in their patterns across these different degree levels. The ratings were slightly higher for jobs that require graduate degrees and more extensive preparation, but the overall patterns were identical across these two different levels that we looked at. And so some of those important skills would include things like active listening, speaking, some of the communication skills, critical thinking, reading comprehension. And those are certainly skills that you are learning in psychology education. We also are starting to see that this pattern may reflect something that's universal across psychology education. We were actually surprised that we didn't see differences in the patterns for the jobs that require graduate degrees. We were expecting, maybe critical thinking is more important. And yes, the ratings are higher, but they're not hugely higher. It's still fairly consistent patterns in the types of skills that are important across all skills. We often are, you see that distinction between the quote unquote hard skills, the math, the science, technology, those kinds of skills, and the quote unquote soft skills. This is showing that the quote unquote soft skills, and I would argue there's nothing soft about these skills. These are in fact the skills that are used in the workplace. They are some of the more important skills. So, being aware of that and teaching your students that these, helping them connect their psychology education to the skills they're learning and types of skills that they'll ultimately be using when they're employed, that's a critical piece that I think is very important to help the discipline realize the value of psychology.
I think I might be familiar with this document. Possibly, was there a big presentation about it at APA last summer? And there's sort of 5 overarching skills with some sub skills, or maybe this is a related document. I remember the one.
That's a good question. I actually had a conflict during that time at APA. I was presenting at APA Psych Careers. But possibly, yes. So I think what you're referencing is the skillful psychology student. That document?
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes. Well, the one that I really like in there and that I think for the listener, we're taping this kind of in mid-March, a little bit early into what I think is going to be a lot of social distancing and changes to our everyday life, that one of these is adaptability. So
yes,
that's,
we see that too.
Maybe you want to talk a little bit about how you've seen adaptability play out here?
Yes, give me just a second. I was actually supposed to go to EPA last week, and I had copies of Skillful Psychology Student with me. Oh, it's right here. Yes. So I'm looking at skillful psychology. Yeah. So it's a very similar thing. We used a slightly different data source to do our data point that was published, I believe, last December, 2019. But same thing. The quote unquote soft skills, the cognitive, the communication, personal, the social, and technological skills. Those are in fact, the ones that are valued in the workplace. We've done some analyses on APA's job board, APA Psych Careers, to look at what are the requirements in psychology job advertisements. And when we looked at some of the skills and the traits, we found that things like adaptability across all types of jobs is amongst, if it's not the top skill, it's definitely amongst the top skills. Ethical, positive attitude, those kinds of things are coming up as being important in psychology jobs, as well as skills like leadership, teamwork, communication. Surprisingly, not so much critical thinking. That didn't come up in those job advertisements, but we suspect that has to do with the hiding in plain sight, or the obvious nature that it's implied that people have those skills. And APA Psych Careers tends to include more doctoral level positions, so it might be one of those assumed characteristics that those individuals hold. For faculty positions, interestingly, cultural awareness was a key skill, and we'd like to do a little bit more research to try to understand exactly why that is happening. We suspect it may be related to the requirements of diversity statements in many faculty applications, but not necessarily. We look for things like diverse populations and those kinds of keywords. So I'm not quite sure what that is picking up. We didn't see that kind of pattern in other types of positions. So I will say, with a lot of these skills, with some of the changes that are happening right now with trying to be adaptable, to shift very quickly the ways that we do our work, psychology as a field, I think, is very well positioned to make those changes, because it's the kind of work we're already doing. And it's just accelerating our shift to be adaptable, to effectively manage change, to be durable and flexible, and to learn in an agile way. We are already doing that. Our jobs already require it. And I think we're in a good position to move appropriately ahead.
Well, I can't think of a more optimistic way to close than that, right? We are in a field that's poised and ready to move ahead and have the skills that we need already, without even sometimes recognizing.
Right.
So I really want to thank you for taking some time to chat with us today, and I encourage everyone to spend some time looking at those reports on the website, either for their own personal knowledge or possibly for use in classes. So thank you so much for your time. Take care.
Thank you. You too.